This is the Capitol Rundown.
We demand that Congress pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
We do want to keep our eye on the long term because, there will be a recession at some point, and we just want to make sure that this program is protected from that.
It's all straight ahead. The Capitol Rundown starts now.
Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm Siobhan Klepfer. History was made this past week in Michigan when Governor Gretchen Whitmer signed Senate Bill 13, moving Michigan closer to the front of the line in the presidential primary process. This now moves our state's primary election next year from the second Tuesday in March to the fourth Tuesday in February. That means our primary next year will be on February 27th. Governor Whitmer says moving Michigan up in that contest will bring economic activity to the state as candidates push to win Michigan votes. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell agrees, adding Michigan is the most diverse battleground state in the union and a better choice to set the tone for the presidential race. Michigan is a big agricultural state, and one of the biggest tasks that Congress will tackle this year is passing a massive farm bill. That bill, which is renewed every 5 years, includes vital resources to help farmers feed the nation and, of course, people here in Michigan. In addition, it funds the nation's food assistance programs. Our Washington correspondent Raquel Martin is here for you now with a look at the first hearing of the year on this bill.
The nation's food supply is taking center stage in Congress this year.
From dairy, apples, asparagus to
Corn, pork, soybeans.
Wednesday, senators discuss ways to improve farming and agriculture trade in the upcoming farm bill. The massive legislation that must be renewed every 5 years.
The success of our agricultural economy requires continued investments in markets and opportunities for farmers.
After the pandemic pushed the nation's food supply chain to the brink, Michigan Democratic Senator Debbie Stabenow says the federal government must do more to help local producers sell what they make in the U.S.
We all have a stake in continuing to make sure that happens.
Ohio Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown says the package should invest in the U.S. meat industry.
It's critical if we're going to lower prices and address corporate consolidation.
And Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley says the U.S. must protect farmers trading abroad.
The concern I hear most from Iowans is access to Mexico's corn market.
In addition to boosting production and trade, some say the farm bill should include more food assistance for countries in need.
Acute hunger levels are 70% higher than pre-pandemic levels in 2019.
Wednesday is just the first in a series of discussions before a bill is finalized. Lawmakers must pass a new package before the current one expires in September. Here for you in Washington, Raquel Martin, 6 News.
Lawmakers heard testimony this past week on the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, which centers around LGBTQ+ community protections. Up next, we'll tell you if any progress was made on that legislation and what both sides have to say about it. Stay with us. Welcome back. Members of the Michigan Civil Rights, Judiciary, and Public Safety Committees met to hear testimony on why some feel the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act should include protections for the LGBTQ+ community and why others say the act is fine the way it is. Dozens attended the committee hearing last week. Right now, the act says an employer cannot withhold employment because of a person's religion, race, color, national origin, age, sex, weight, height, or marital status. Now, some members of the committee feel the act should be more specific and include the words sexual orientation and gender identity, or wording to ensure the protection of people within the LGBTQ+ community. Here's a little bit from both sides on the proposed change.
Please do right by each other, do right by our children, and do right by our state by explicitly extending the civil rights protections within the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act to the LGBTQ+ community. The time to act on this is now.
But reducing identity to something so casual, something that could be exploited in such a transient way, really diminishes what it means to be a human person with a unique identity specially created by God.
The committee plans to meet again this week to hear more comments before taking a final vote. Michigan taxpayers could soon be getting checks as part of a Democratic-led plan for inflation relief. The governor announced the plan today, including checks to taxpayers as well as tax cuts for families and retirees. Our Capitol correspondent Tim Skubic is here for you now with those details.
Governor Gretchen Whitmer and the two Democratic leaders have finally figured out what they want to do when it comes to tax relief for you, and it's a new wrinkle that could get the Republicans to think twice about whether they like this plan or not. Here's what we have learned. The governor and the House Speaker Joe Tate and the Senate Democratic leader Winnie Brinks have decided that they'll do senior tax relief through a tax credit. They'll also have needy families getting some tax breaks from the state. But here's the new wrinkle. A one-time, what they're calling inflationary rebate check of an undisclosed amount of money. In other words, a check that would go in the mail to every taxpayer to fight inflation. This is the new wrinkle that the Democrats like. The question is, the Republicans would rather, at least at this read, roll back the state income tax rate. But will they now take a look at what the governor proposed? Because a check in your hand is not the same as a tax credit on your income tax form, if you get my drift. There's a bigger political pop for what the governor wants to do and less of a pop for what the Republicans want to do. So they will now look at this new proposal, which will be on the table next week. Could we have a vote on this, yay or nay? We don't know, and we haven't heard from the Republicans yet. It will be an interesting debate as the tax cut fever engulfs this town. The question is, what will it look like in the end?
All right, Tim Skubic, thank you. Police reform is a hot topic among U.S. lawmakers right now, adding pressure to the Biden administration to get legislation passed. We'll have the latest on that after the break and a gun safety debate within the Natural Resources Committee meetings. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Capitol Rundown. In the nation's capital, the beating death of Tyre Nichols at the hands of police officers in Memphis, Tennessee has put renewed pressure on the Biden administration to pass the stalled George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Among other things, the legislation aimed to limit unnecessary use of force, restrict the use of no-knock warrants and chokeholds, and limit qualified immunity, which shields officers from many potential civil lawsuits. Congress started work on the bill after the death of George Floyd in police custody, but it's been stalled for a year and a half. This was something Vice President Kamala Harris brought up this week at the funeral of Tyre Nichols.
We demand that Congress pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Joe Biden will sign it.
The president and vice president met this week with the Congressional Black Caucus to figure out how to make progress on the bill. However, with Republicans now in control of the House, the legislation faces a steep uphill climb. A House committee that typically focuses its energy on nature found itself debating guns instead. The Republican majority of the Natural Resources Committee voted Wednesday to get rid of a ban on carrying firearms into the committee room. Our Washington correspondent Jesse Trenor is here for you now with that report.
We have the right to defend ourselves.
Wednesday, Republicans on the House Natural Resources Committee removed a rule that banned lawmakers from carrying guns into their meetings.
I reserve the right to carry my firearm in whatever capacity I want to without your permission.
Florida Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna called the rule unnecessary and said Democrats shouldn't feel threatened if they're armed.
Do you think we're going to hurt you? We will never hurt you. I would use my firearm to defend you, just to be clear.
Colorado Congresswoman Lauren Boebert argued she needs a loaded gun everywhere at the U.S. Capitol.
Not all of us hire personal security. Most of us like to take that personal responsibility and be our own security.
When they held the House majority, Democrats on the committee added the rule after the January 6th attack on the Capitol.
No one should have to worry about members of the other side of the aisle, let alone members who have incited political violence, bringing weapons in violation of House rules into our committee room.
California Congressman Jared Huffman called the rule common sense. And Arizona Congressman Ruben Gallego said lawmakers carrying a gun at the Capitol is often a political stunt.
There's some people here that are not very well trained weapons, but like to use it as a prop.
Democrats like these said this decision, as well as the removal of metal detectors outside the House chamber, raised security concerns ahead of President Biden's State of the Union address there next week. In Washington, I'm Jesse Tenor.
Coming up next on the Rundown, state lawmakers introduced multiple bills this week in Lansing focusing on gas stove appreciation and anonymous lotto winners. The latest on that and more is coming up after the break. Welcome back. A group of 36 Republicans in the State House introduced a resolution this past week hoping to declare Gas Stove Appreciation Day. Conservative politicians and pundits around the country have been singing the praises of the gas stove ever since a new study was released showing the devices leak toxic gases like benzene into people's homes even when they're shut off. This has led to concerns about a possible ban on gas stoves, although no such ban has been proposed, and the White House says it has no interest in banning the appliances. The resolution introduced by Republicans in Lansing says gas stoves were a deeply important invention, and any attempt to ban people from buying them would be an attack on our republic. It has been referred to the State House Committee on Government Operations. Another bill introduced this past week by two State House Republicans would offer a little help to a group of people who are already pretty lucky, and that's because this bill is for those who win multi-state lottery games like the Powerball or Mega Millions. Under this bill, the identifying information of those winners would be exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. That means if you win a big jackpot, you could collect the prize anonymously if you wanted. Right now, those names, the names of the winners, is public record. This bill now heads to the State House Committee on Regulatory Reform. The U.S. is a few months away from hitting its debt ceiling, which means the federal government won't be able to pay for military wages, fund government programs, and cover the national debt. Officials say it would be an economic disaster for our country. Republicans in Congress say they will not help avert it until Democrats agree to spending cuts. President Joe Biden says he doesn't want to negotiate on what should be a nonpartisan issue. Alexandra Limon has the latest from both sides.
Even though Democrats are warning of a potential catastrophe, Republicans say they won't back down from their debt ceiling demands.
Now, let me say this, we'll never default. That's not going to happen. But I do think we need to be serious about finding spending cuts.
Congressman James Comer and Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy say Democrats need to agree to spending cuts before they agree to raise the debt limit.
I want to look at every single dollar we're spending.
McCarthy hopes to move toward a deal when he meets with President Biden Wednesday.
But President Biden says these types of negotiations in 2011 hurt the nation's economy and credit rating.
On Sunday, he also vowed to veto any deal that guts Social Security and Medicare. House Republicans say those programs won't be on the chopping block.
We can cut spending without cutting Social Security and Medicare.
But Republican Senator John Cornyn says restructuring is necessary.
Dealing with things like entitlement programs that are going to become insolvent in the next few years.
Democrats say they're happy to discuss other spending, but insist the debt ceiling shouldn't be held hostage.
Republicans are being completely irrational about not paying the nation's debt. You and I would have to pay our credit card debt.
Here for you in Washington, Alexandra Limon, 6 News.
Coming up, the state's college scholarship program helps aspiring students across Michigan every year. And after the break, we'll tell you why it could be in jeopardy going forward. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Capitol Rundown. The Chinese balloon caught flying over the U.S. is now being classified as intentional and not a weather craft that blew off course. As of Friday evening, it was traveling over the Midwest after lingering in Montana airspace, which is home to one of America's 3 nuclear missile silo fields. A U.S. senior official is calling it a bold move on the government's part to have it hover over U.S. territory. Military officials say the balloon was last flying at 60,000 feet, which is higher than most U.S. warplanes or aircrafts can fly. This balloon discovery comes as U.S. officials continue cracking down on TikTok, which officials believe could also be used for spying. Republicans locally and nationally have weighed in on the situation, including Michigan Congressman John Moolenaar. He issued a statement saying, in part, this incident is a violation of American airspace, and it shows exactly why we must take aggression from the Chinese Communist Party seriously. The CCP is not a distant problem that we can ignore. He goes on to say, it affects every part of our lives, whether it is in the skies or on our phones. I will be working on the select committee to address these issues and help our country prepare for future challenges from the CCP. Well, the Michigan Achievement Scholarship is the largest assistance program in our state, offering college students thousands of dollars every year for their tuition. However, as our Capitol correspondent Tim Skubic reports, there is concern in the higher education community about long-term funding for that program.
The good news is 80% of all families in Michigan are eligible for the $500 million Michigan Achievement Scholarship, with $5,500 for those attending a 4-year university, $4,000 for those going to an independent college program, and $2,750 for community college students. But there's a potential downside. The program is being funded now on a year-to-year basis. And that means when the next recession hits, state lawmakers may be forced to scrap this scholarship, like they did with the Michigan Promise. To avoid that disruption, the higher education community is asking lawmakers to find a permanent funding source that is not at risk every year.
But we do want to keep our eye on the long term because, there will be a recession at some point, and we just want to make sure that this program is protected from that recession.
The Independent College Association has asked the state budget director for the earmark, but other folks have their eye on the money too.
It currently raises about $1 billion, so I think there's room to do more than one thing with it. But, I freely admit that I'm not the first guy to walk into the budget director's office with an idea of grabbing some of the corporate income tax.
Lansing Senator Sarah Anthony, who chairs the Senate Budget Committee, favors the permanent funding concept, as does the House Budget Chair, Representative Angela Whitwer. But there's a but.
They like the idea of a dedicated revenue source, but they're not fully committed on whether it's going to be the corporate income tax or another piece.
For those who graduate from high school this year, they could be in line for the state financial aid, which is in the budget for the next 2 years. But higher education is hoping to pass a permanent funding source by the end of this year to make sure the aid never runs out. Earview in Lansing, Tim Skubic, 6 News.
If you're interested in getting more political news from Michigan and Washington, we've got just the thing. You can sign up for our Capitol Rundown newsletter. It's just one email each week, and you can get it by pointing your cell phone camera at your screen right now. This will take you to the sign-up page, or you can head to WLNS.com/newsletters. And that's our show for this week. Thanks for watching the Capitol Rundown.